The ballroom glowed with chandeliers, laughter spilling over champagne glasses, and the river's golden shimmer beyond the tall windows. On the surface, it was the kind of joy families dream of: a son's second wedding, music humming low roses set in perfect white bouquets. Yet beneath that glow, a tension pressed against my chest, subtle but undeniable, like the hush before a storm. And then it happened. Ethan, my 7-year-old grandson, slid his small hand into mine, his fingers icy, his voice breaking the glittering spell as he whispered, "Grandma, don't look under the table. If you are listening to my story right now, I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments below where in the world you're watching this from, and share how this moment makes you feel. Your thoughts matter to me more than you know, and if my story speaks to you, please don't forget to subscribe so we can keep walking through these difficult, unforgettable memories together." My name is Margaret Hale, and I'm 63 years old. I spent most of my working life as a librarian at a small neighborhood branch in New Orleans, surrounded by books that kept me company when life grew lonely. I am a widow now, my husband gone for nearly a decade, and much of my heart lives in my grandson, Ethan. He carries pieces of his late mother, Sophia, in his smile and in the quiet way he holds on to me when the world feels too loud. That evening, I sat beside him at table 12, close enough to watch the glow of candlelight dance across his pale cheeks. Daniel, my son, stood across the room, radiant in his navy suit, moving from table to table with a smile that looked convincing to most. But I am his mother. I know a smile meant to hide hollowness when I see one. Since Sophia's accident, Daniel has been chasing something he cannot name, burying grief under layers of work, and now perhaps under the sparkle of Vanessa, the woman in white, across the hall. I adjusted Ethan's bow tie gently, a small mothering gesture I never quite let go of, and I thought of Sophia, how her laughter used to fill our Sunday afternoons, how she'd place chili on my kitchen table with a pride that made me feel whole. Ethan's toy car tapped softly on the tablecloth, the steady rhythm oddly out of place against the violin strings and clinking glassware. And then he froze. His car stopped mid-roll, his little eyes darkened with something I'd only seen once before on the night of his mother's funeral. I leaned closer, whispering, "What's wrong, my love?" He pressed his lips tight as if he carried a secret too heavy for his years. That's when he told me not to look. The words slid into me like ice water. The celebration around us blurred Vanessa's rehearsed smile in photographs, Daniel's bright laugh with old friends, the waiters gliding through the room, balancing plates of shrimp cocktail that glistened under the light. I felt the air squeeze my lungs. I did not look, not yet. Instead, I placed my hand on Ethan's hair, steadying him, steadying myself. Sometimes silence buys you seconds to think, to breathe, to decide if you're ready for the truth. And sometimes, silence is the very thing that breaks you. I kept my hand on Ethan's hair a little longer than I needed to, pretending to smooth the strands that had fallen across his forehead. The truth is, I was buying time to calm my racing heart, to gather myself before the memories came rushing back. Because when a child looks at you with that kind of fear, you cannot help but remember the ghosts that still linger in the corners of your family. It has been 3 years since Sophia died. Even now, I can hardly bring myself to say those words aloud. She was only 32, full of life, driving home from work when a truck skidded across the wet highway. A moment's loss of control, they told us. But it was more than that. It was the end of laughter in Daniel's house, the end of a young mother's lullabies, the end of the only woman who had ever made me feel like I had a daughter. After the funeral, Ethan would crawl into my bed at night, clutching his toy car as if it were a shield. He was only 4 then. His questions were simple and devastating. "Grandma, where did Mommy go? When is she coming back?" I answered as gently as I could, but guilt ate at me every time. I had been with Sophia just hours before her accident, reminding her to drive carefully in the rain. She smiled, said she'd be fine. I should have insisted I tell myself even now, maybe if I'd done more. That kind of guilt never leaves a mother-in-law who loved her daughter-in-law like her own. Since then, Ethan has been my shadow and I his anchor. Daniel tried, I know he did, but grief made him restless, absent. He buried himself in work, returning home long after Ethan was asleep, leaving me to patch the holes with bedtime stories and peanut butter sandwiches cut just the way Sophia used to make them. I became grandmother and mother, both though the ache of not being enough has followed me into every quiet night. Rachel, Sophia's older sister, never forgave Daniel. She visits Ethan often, brings coloring books, sometimes takes him for ice cream on Saturdays. But there is always a tension in her voice when Daniel's name comes up. She looks at him with the sharpness of someone who believes he moved on too quickly, that marrying again is not just betrayal, but erasure. Tonight at the wedding, her presence feels like a shadow stretching across the dance floor. She sits only 2 tables away, her back straight, her eyes steady. She has always been protective of Ethan, and for that I am grateful. But she has never once spoken to me without reminding me subtly, or not, that Daniel has failed his son. Earlier that evening, when I greeted her at the entrance, she gave me a polite hug, but whispered, "This shouldn't be happening so soon, Margaret." Her words stung, because part of me agreed. Daniel was smiling tonight, but it was not the kind of joy that comes from healing. It was the brittle joy of someone desperate to prove he could feel again. I watched him as he raised a glass with his friends. Vanessa's hand looped through his arm, her laughter echoing across the hall. On the surface, it looked like happiness, yet I could not shake the image of Sophia's funeral. Daniel's shoulders hunched, his face buried in his hands, Ethan's tiny body clinging to me, whispering, "Don't cry, Grandma. How can you bury that and replace it with champagne bubbles and photographs?" Rachel's gaze found mine across the room, steady and cold, as if she were asking me silently whose side I was on. It is a question I have asked myself many times. I want Daniel to find peace, but at what cost? I want Ethan to feel safe. But how can he when every glance at Vanessa seems to tighten his small body with unease? The jazz band played on guests toasted, but under the surface of that glittering ballroom, the fault lines of our family were showing. Grief had carved us into fragments, Daniel chasing new beginnings, Rachel clutching to the past, Ethan carrying fears too heavy for his young shoulders, and me caught between them trying to hold the pieces together with hands that trembled more than I cared to admit. And now as Ethan pressed closer to me, whispering warnings, I did not yet understand. I felt it again, that old wound opening, the echo of Sophia's absence swelling like a tide. I had come tonight hoping for a fragile kind of peace, but instead I sensed the past had followed us here, ready to unravel everything in the most public way possible. The fault lines I felt in that ballroom grew sharper the moment Vanessa stepped fully into view. She glided across the floor in her beaded gown, every move practiced, every smile as polished as the silver laid out before us. Vanessa worked in public relations. I suppose it made sense that she could command a room with such ease. But what unsettled me was not her confidence. It was the way her presence seemed to swallow the air, leaving little space for anyone else to breathe. She leaned into Daniel, fingers light on his arm, her voice rising just enough for nearby guests to hear her laughter. To most, she was radiant, gracious. To me, it felt staged, as if she were playing the lead role in a performance she had rehearsed for months. My son, blinded by the hope of starting over, seemed grateful for the act. But I noticed Ethan shrink lower in his chair each time Vanessa's eyes drifted toward him. I watched closely as she approached our table, once crouching to Ethan's level. With a bar of chocolate she pulled from her purse. "This is for you, sweetheart," she said, her smile wide, her voice dipped in sugar. Ethan's little hands tightened around his toy car. He did not touch the candy. He turned his face away, his silence louder than any refusal. Vanessa's smile flickered for just a second before she caught me watching. She smoothed her expression quickly, too quickly. And then there was Lucas. He had been Daniel's closest friend since college, a man who knew our family's history, who had been at Sophia's funeral, who had carried Ethan on his shoulders during Mardi Gras parades when Daniel was too tired to join. Tonight, though, Lucas seemed different. His laughter rang too loudly at Vanessa's jokes, his gaze lingered too long when she walked past. More than once, I caught the faintest exchange, a quick glance, a shared smirk that made something twist uncomfortably in my chest. Perhaps I was reading too much into it. Grief can make suspicion bloom where it shouldn't. Yet as I sat there, I could not ignore the unease that crawled up my spine. Daniel, so eager to prove he had found happiness again, seemed oblivious. He poured Vanessa more wine, his smile softening in ways I hadn't seen since Sophia was alive. For a fleeting moment, I wanted to believe it was real, that maybe he had finally found someone who could bring warmth back into his life. But then I saw it, the look Vanessa gave Ethan when she thought no one was watching. A flicker of irritation, almost disdain, as if the child's existence were an inconvenience she had not planned for. It lasted only an instant, but I caught it, and I knew Ethan had too. His small shoulders stiffened, and he pressed closer to me. The jazz band played on, and the guests cheered when Daniel lifted his glass once more. To them, it was a celebration of love renewed. To me, it was a stage where masks were worn so tightly they were bound to crack. And as I held Ethan's trembling hand beneath the table, I realized the night was moving towards something I could not yet name, but which I feared would leave none of us untouched. The moment passed quickly, yet it lingered in my chest like a bruise that refused to fade. Vanessa's fleeting glare at Ethan had unsettled me, but I told myself to stay composed. The band shifted to a livelier tune. Glasses clinked in unison, and guests rose in cheer as Daniel lifted his champagne high. Around me, the room shimmered with celebration, but at our table, the silence between Ethan and me grew heavier. He set his toy car on the tablecloth, nudging it back and forth absent-mindedly, his little face pale under the candlelight. Then, with a sudden movement, the car slipped from his fingers and rolled toward the floor. He ducked down quickly, and I heard the rustle of fabric as the tablecloth shifted. A second later, Ethan reappeared, his eyes wide, his lips trembling as if he had stumbled into something too heavy for his small heart to hold. "Grandma," he whispered, clutching at my sleeve. His hand was icy again. There's a paper." My pulse quickened. "What kind of paper, darling?" He glanced down nervously and then bent beneath the table once more. When he sat back up, his hand shook as he held out a small, folded square. The candlelight caught its creases, faint but deliberate, as if someone had tucked it there to be found by the wrong or the right person. I unfolded it carefully, my fingers trembling. Just a few words scribbled in hurried pen, table 12. Add shrimp to the child's serving. The world tilted. My breath caught in my throat. Shrimp! Ethan's allergy was no secret. It was life-threatening, a single bite enough to send him into shock. Everyone in our family knew. Everyone. I looked at my grandson. His small chest rose and fell quickly, fear shining in his eyes. "Grandma, am I going to be okay?" he asked, voice cracking in that fragile way that pierced me deeper than any scream. I wrapped my arms around him, pulling him close, trying to steady my voice. "Yes, my love, you're safe. I promise." But inside my heart was pounding. My blood turned cold. Who would do this? And why of all nights would someone dare here under the guise of celebration around us? The ballroom carried on as if nothing had shifted. Laughter rose, champagne flowed. Daniel's voice rang out across the tables. Vanessa twirled her glass, her smile flashing for the cameras. To them, everything was perfect. But in my hands, the note burned like evidence of something cruel hidden beneath all that glitter. I pressed Ethan tighter against me as though I could shield him from whatever danger lurked just out of sight. My fingers still clutched the note, the ink smudging against my skin. I forced myself to breathe, but I knew something had broken open in that moment. The celebration was a mask, and behind it lay a darkness I could no longer ignore. I held the note in my trembling hand, its weight far heavier than the paper it was written on. For a long moment, I sat frozen, listening to the laughter and clinking glasses around me, wondering if I had the courage to shatter the illusion of joy that filled the ballroom. Ethan pressed close against my side, his small fingers gripping mine with a desperation that gave me strength. I realized silence was no longer safety. It was betrayal. I rose to my feet. The scrape of my chair against the polished floor cut through the music, startling the guests nearby. My voice, steadier than I expected, carried across the tables. Who wrote this? Who wanted shrimp added to my grandson's plate? The effect was immediate. The hum of conversation stopped as though the room itself held its breath. Daniel turned sharply, confusion clouding his face as he hurried toward me. Vanessa froze mid-laugh, her glass hovering in her hand, the perfect mask of delight slipping just slightly. "What's going on, Mom?" Daniel asked, his voice taut, his smile gone. I laid the crumpled note on the table between us. The ink glistened under the candlelight, undeniable. He read it once, then again, his color draining. This has to be some mistake," he stammered, glancing around the room as if an answer might appear in the faces of his guests. A stir rose from the back as the head chef, Antonio, approached. He was an old friend of the family, a man who had prepared countless Sunday dinners in my kitchen when Daniel was a boy. His eyes were troubled as he looked at the note. "I received this," he admitted quietly. "It was handed to me by one of the servers, a young woman. I thought it was a simple instruction, nothing more. I didn't know." The room rippled with whispers, a sea of murmurs moving like wind through dry leaves. All eyes darted from the note to Ethan, who now hid his face in my side. Vanessa stepped forward at last, her hand pressed to her chest. "Surely this is some terrible misunderstanding," she said, her voice smooth but tight. "Who would ever think to harm a child, Margaret? You mustn't frighten people like this." But before I could respond, another voice broke through the clear, sharp tone of Rachel. She pushed back her chair and stood, her face pale but resolute. "I saw you, Vanessa," she said firmly. "I saw you whispering to a server just before dinner. Don't deny it." The air thickened. Guests shifted in their seats, their eyes darting between the bride and me, between Daniel and Rachel. For the first time all evening, Vanessa's smile faltered completely. She opened her mouth as if to protest, but the words caught in her throat. In that suspended silence, I felt the tide turning. What began as a whisper under the table had now broken wide open, forcing the truth into the light of the chandeliers. The silence that followed Rachel's words was deafening. For a heartbeat, it felt as though the entire ballroom had frozen. The chandeliers still glimmered, the band's instruments hung in the air, but every soul present was suspended in a single, unspoken question. Vanessa's lips parted, her denial hovering at the edge of speech. Then, like glass cracking under pressure, a sob broke through the stillness. From the far side of the room, Clara Daniel's young cousin, barely 19, stood trembling, her face pale as the linen tablecloths. Tears streaked her cheeks as she cried out, "It was me." I gave the note to the kitchen. Vanessa told me to. "I didn't know it would hurt, Ethan. I swear I didn't know." The room erupted in gasps. I felt Daniel's body stiffen beside me, his hand reaching for the edge of the table as though to steady himself. My own breath caught a mix of horror and relief, because the truth was spilling out at last, no longer hidden in shadows. Vanessa spun toward Clara, her voice sharp, laced with desperation. "How dare you say such a thing? You're confused, you misunderstood me." Her tone, once velvet, had hardened to steel. But Clara only wept harder, covering her face with her hands. All around us, guests whispered their shock, turning quickly into suspicion. I could see the tide shift, their admiration for the glittering bride dissolving into doubt. Daniel's eyes searched Vanessa's face as though he were seeing her clearly for the first time. His mouth opened, but no words came. He looked broken, caught between disbelief and the evidence unraveling before him. And then Lucas stepped forward. His voice cut through the murmurs, too eager, too defensive. "Let's not jump to conclusions. Vanessa would never harm Ethan. Clara must have misunderstood." He tried to place a steadying hand on Daniel's shoulder, but his words betrayed him. She only wanted to make sure the boy was handled. The phrase hung in the air, sour and unmistakable. A collective gasp swept the hall. Daniel turned to Lucas, his expression darkening, realization dawning like a cruel sunrise. "You knew," he whispered, the weight of betrayal thick in his voice. "You knew, and you said nothing." Lucas faltered, his face draining of color, but it was too late. The damage was done. I felt Ethan clutch me tighter, burying his face against my side. My heart ached not only for him, but for my son standing there stripped of illusions, his best friend revealed as complicit. his bride exposed as something far more sinister than he had ever dared to imagine. The ballroom no longer felt like a wedding. It had become a courtroom, every guest a witness, every whispered doubt an accusation. I stood there in the center of it all, the crumpled note still in my hand, realizing that this night meant to mark a new beginning had instead dragged us all into a reckoning no one could escape. Daniel stood motionless as if rooted to the ground. The color had drained from his face, his eyes darting between Vanessa and Lucas, two people he had trusted most in this new chapter of his life. Betrayal seemed to hang in the air like smoke after a fire-thick, suffocating, impossible to ignore. I watched him struggle for words, but none came. His silence spoke louder than any outburst could have. Rachel was the first to break through. She rose from her chair, her voice sharp, cutting across the stunned quiet. "You were blind, Daniel," she said, her tone trembling with both anger and grief. "So desperate to prove you could love again that you nearly let your own son pay the price. Do you even realize tonight could have ended with Ethan in a hospital bed or worse?" Her words landed like blows. Daniel flinched, his shoulders sagging as though under an unbearable weight. He tried to speak to defend himself, but the truth had already taken hold. He had been blinded not only by Vanessa's carefully polished smile, but also by his own aching need to escape grief. I placed my hand firmly on the table, my voice rising steady and unwavering. "Anyone who dares to harm Ethan will never be part of this family. Not today, not ever." The words surprised even me, but they were the only truth left standing. I felt Ethan's small hand curl into mine, and in that moment, all the fear that had held me silent melted into resolve. A ripple moved through the guests. Whispers grew louder. Faces turned away from Vanessa, eyes narrowed at Lucas. Some stood up in open disgust, their chairs scraping against the floor. "Unbelievable," someone muttered. Another shook their head and walked toward the door. The joyous glow of the wedding had collapsed, leaving only a bitter taste of betrayal. Vanessa tried to reach for Daniel's arm, her voice pleading now stripped of its practiced charm. "Daniel, you can't believe them. Please, you know me." But he stepped back, his hand raised as though warding her off. His gaze was hollow, raw. "I thought I did," he whispered. Lucas, too, attempted to salvage dignity, but every word he uttered only deepened the sense of treachery. The sight of him standing there, no longer Daniel's loyal friend, but a man exposed by his own slip of tongue, left the room colder than before. I looked at my son and saw a man unraveling his dreams, shattering in front of 100 witnesses. My heart ached for him, but my conviction held stronger. Ethan's life, Ethan's safety, that was the line that could never be crossed. The music had stopped long ago. Now the only sound was the shuffle of feet as more guests departed, unwilling to stay in a room so poisoned by deceit. And with each exit, it became clearer this was no wedding anymore. It was the burial of illusions, the final collapse of trust. When the last of the guests filed out, leaving behind half-empty glasses and wilting flowers, the ballroom felt like a shell of what it had been only hours before. The chandeliers still glowed, but the light seemed colder, as though even they knew the joy had gone out of the room. Vanessa stood near the door, her veil slipping from one shoulder, her face pale beneath layers of makeup. Lucas hovered close, his usual easy charm stripped bare. The whispers of those who remained were sharp, unforgiving. And then, almost mercifully, security arrived to escort them both away. They left not as newlyweds or honored guests, but as pariahs, their departure heavy with humiliation. Vanessa avoided every gaze, her head bowed, while Lucas tried for defiance, but only managed to look small, diminished by his own betrayal. When the doors closed behind them, a silence fell so complete I could hear Ethan's soft breathing against my side. Daniel sank into a chair, his head in his hands. For the first time in years, I saw him cry without restraint. No mask, no pretense. My son, who had tried so hard to outrun grief, now sat broken in the ruins of his own choices. I wanted to reach for him to tell him that healing does not come through forgetting, but through facing the pain and carrying it together. Instead, I placed my hand on his shoulder, steady and firm. Ethan climbed into his lap, small arms wrapping around his father's neck, offering comfort in the purest form. Rachel approached. Then her usual fire dimmed. She looked at Daniel, and though her voice still carried an edge, it was softer. "I was hard on you," she admitted quietly. "But only because I was scared of losing Ethan, too." She glanced down at the boy nestled against his father. "We've both lost enough." For the first time since Sophia's death, I saw something shift between them. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the first fragile step toward it. Rachel began visiting more after that night, not with accusations, but with gentle care, bringing books for Ethan, staying for supper, helping me with the small, ordinary tasks that build a home. Slowly, the sharpness in her gaze softened, and in its place grew a quiet loyalty I'd longed for. Daniel, too, began to change. The guilt did not leave him, but he carried it differently. He spent his evenings at home instead of at the office, walking Ethan to school in the mornings, listening when the boy spoke of nightmares or dreams. And in those moments, I noticed his eyes linger on Rachel, hesitant, almost ashamed at first, but gradually more open, as though he were beginning to see her not only as Sophia's sister, but as someone who had stood by our family even when he had faltered. I do not know what the future holds, but I have learned this family is not built on sparkling vows or carefully staged smiles. It is forged in the quiet acts of protection, the stubborn refusal to give up on one another, the love that remains when everything else falls away. And as I watched Ethan laugh again in the weeks that followed his toy car clattering across my kitchen floor, I knew we had survived, not because we were unbroken, but because we had chosen together to rise from the wreckage.